Here's what I think Jim was getting at. When you look at the automotive industry here in the United States, for over 25 years now, we have had a seamless North American industry. As you mentioned just a minute ago, Joe, parts, components, and vehicles flow back and forth across the border. In some cases, components several times before they become a finished vehicle. This benefits American consumers. We get more affordable vehicles. We get more choice. And the U.S. ends up more competitive as a result of it. So here's what I think Jim's getting at. If you look at the scale of this industry, it's massive. These plants, and you've been in them, millions of square feet under roof. These are massive assets. You cannot move these assets overnight. You can't shift supply chains overnight. You can't move production overnight. So what could happen is costs could increase on consumers before jobs come into the United States. That's the dilemma. That's the challenge of tariffs that appear out of nowhere.
Well, but the president would argue that the tariffs are intended to protect American industry, protect American-made cars. So what is the appropriate way to do that if it's not through policies like this?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think President Trump really understands the importance of a healthy and competitive auto industry. I have no doubt about that. I listened carefully during the campaign. We've had an opportunity to talk to the team. I feel like he understands this importance, the importance of a competitive auto industry. I think the way to focus on this is through discussions that will occur when USMCA, for example, is reviewed. In other words, the trade agreement between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. So during that process, these are the types of conversations that should take place. What should those parties to the agreement do in order to comply with duty-free trade? Those are reasonable questions, and I think that's ultimately what Jim's saying is, look, we need a review.
Sticking with Jim Farley for a minute, after he came to Washington, he warmed up to the idea of putting tariffs on imported vehicles. He said, we applaud President Trump's idea to look at all vehicle imports into the U.S., an important step forward, which now then calls into question, what's an imported vehicle? Because we just talked about American cars going back and forth across the border for various stages of assembly. Does that count?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? There is no 100% U.S. vehicle or 100% Mexican-made vehicle or 100% Canadian-made vehicle.
And you've got Europeans assembling cars here in the U.S.
Yeah, so to me, the big question is, do we need and want a healthy and competitive auto industry in the United States? And I think the answer to that, and I think the president agrees, is yes, because it's important to our economic security and it's important to our national security. When you think about how cutting edge the manufacturing sector is, the automotive sector is in the United States, and how important technology is to vehicles and how important that technology is to our national defense, I think that you really do need to focus on competitiveness. And I think that's what this administration will do.
And is it competitiveness specifically with China that you're most focused on?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. When you look at what's happening, there is an intense global competition for automotive investments. And it's really happening in three areas: China, clearly, the United States, and Europe. And it's important that the U.S. is competitive in this dynamic. Right now, what you see in China, and I was recently there just before the end of the year, what you see there is an industry with massive overcapacity, lots of government subsidies, and a desire to export all that extra capacity. And the question is this trade that's likely to happen, is it fair? Right? Or is this anti-competitive behavior? And so that is really going to be an important question for policymakers.
When we talk about China, we're not going to see BYD selling cars here anytime soon, I can only imagine. But what will be the impact, with that said, of the lifting or the rescinding of EV tax credits and other incentives? Elon Musk is doing pretty well at Tesla right now, but you've also got Jim Farley, Mary Barra, and others trying to break into this nascent business. What does this bring to the table?
Yeah, I think context is really important here. There's two bits of context I think we have to understand when we talk about the EV incentives.
Yeah.
The first piece of context is We right now, as an auto industry in the United States, face significant challenging automotive regulations, emission standards. Those really challenging emission standards, both set at the federal level in the Biden administration and by the state of California, and that's a crazy land story we can get into, those were based on the assumption that EV incentives would stay.
Yes, right.
So if you take the incentives out, my question to you would be, did the standards go away? And so that's context number one. Context number two, what we were just talking about, the importance of a healthy and competitive industry in this competition with China and the Chinese automotive industry. I would make an argument that the incentives are important in both sets of contexts. In other words, they are important in a context where you've got really aggressive standards, and they're particularly important as we transform our industrial base to remain competitive and become competitive with China.
Well, and you just, in your first answer talking to us about China, talked about how China heavily subsidizes its own automotive industry. So is it a mistake for the U.S. to be pulling back subsidies of any kind? Do we actually need more of them?
Yeah, I think this is exactly the question. If you believe in a healthy, competitive auto industry, and you believe that that industry, that competitive and healthy industry, is supportive of our economic and national security, you should look at a balance between regulation and policy. And in this case, policy would be incentives. These incentives are not just the consumer incentives that a lot of people have focused on. In other words, money available at the dealership to support the purchase of an EV. We're talking about incentives to transform the industrial base, to build the automotive industry of the future. That is really important for this industry.
What does this mean for innovation at a time when we realize, you know what, most people are buying hybrids, not EVs.
Right.
And that Elon Musk may not have a consumer-priced vehicle anytime soon.
Right. Hybrids are a form of electrified vehicle, right? And I love this idea that consumers have choice. And I think that's essential. They should have a choice, a gasoline vehicle if it fits their wants and needs, a hybrid, a plug-in hybrid, or a battery electric vehicle.
Can we keep up with China when it comes to innovation in that world?
That's the key. The key is you need an innovative and vibrant auto industry. And so to be able to have choice including electrified vehicles, is going to be really important. So you got to build an industrial base to have that innovation and choice.
Well, and obviously we've talked about, and you were talking about these large facilities that actually assemble these cars, but what about battery technology? What about the chips that need to power these cars that can do so much more from a technological basis? Talk to us about kind of those lower rungs of this.
Yeah, and they're not much lower, right? If you think about it, I mean, the battery is critical to the vehicle, a hybrid vehicle, as well as a battery electric vehicle. And so are these computer chips. Vehicles are effectively computers on wheels. And consumers recognize this. And so you need to have access to cutting edge technology. That means computer chips or semiconductors, and it also means the latest battery technology. And so investments. Now, should government do all of this? Absolutely not. But the innovators are leading. And so you see chipset manufacturers investing in the United States. You see battery manufacturers investing in the United States. The question is, for some period of time, should there be some supportive policy that encourages those investments while the market remains choppy? The market is going to be spiky for some period of time as we transform to these new technologies.
We're almost out of time. When do we get robo-taxi? When does self-driving happen for real? Let's get to the innovation, the fun stuff for a minute.
Well, look, I think you can go to some places and get in a robo-taxi right now.
How about here in Washington?
Absolutely. You know what the problem is with highly automated vehicles? The holdup is not the engineering or the science. The holdup is the policy.
Once again,
we need a national policy that recognizes, again, same idea, the competitive importance of this technology in the U.S. market.